That's interesting. Just blew that one away. And I don't know why. I had the music, but I lost it. So let's see. Sounds as if music is coming in. Ah, but I can't hear it. Let's see if this works. Nope, no sound. Well, technical problems today. Got no sound. It seems as if it must be playing. Let's see if we can hear it here. So, I can start. Welcome to The Information Philosopher. I'm Bob Doyle, webcasting from my iTV studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm hoping to reach philosophers and scientists around the world to help solve several great problems in philosophy, in physics, in biology, and psychology. The key to finding solutions is to understand the physical, even metaphysical, nature of information. Information is a physical thing, but it is not made of material. We live in the information age, but few philosophers understand that information is neither matter nor energy. Okay, I'm now live on Facebook and YouTube, and I'd like to turn our attention today to our Tuesday lecture subject, which is free will. My work is presented primarily in 3 books and a website. The website looks like this, and it consists of a very large number of drop-down menus, which in this case just took me to another place, the knowledge section, the value section of my website. It's too bad these don't stay large so we can see them. And now I see the drawback of using the Surface Pro because it doesn't let me just drop down. Let's see if I can go over to Information Philosopher website on my bio. And look at it there. And now we have it on most of our screens. If I come to screen 3 and make an adjustment here, you can see it behind me here on my wall screen. So at the moment it's on the Freedom page, and I can scroll down and travel to other pages. Now the Freedom page is the major material that I have written over the years on the concept of freedom. Freedom of action, but then also what's called freedom of the will. I have many, many individual topics here on the left-hand side, all of them very highly technical in some respects, aspects of free will. You see here is freedom of action, and here's free will, and I can't put a mouse over them or I'll jump onto those pages. So over the next many, many weeks of lectures, I hope my lectures will go on for years, to fully explain or try to explain the many arguments that have been put on through the ages on the issue of free will. I'll hope to cover many of these, sometimes just one or two topics in a single lecture. The big argument in free will that says there is no free will is called the standard argument against free will. So let's expand this page and take a close look at this standard argument. I guess I can nicely size the page, and I hope that will allow you to see the details. Let me go back to this page, and that's not the one I want. I want service standard argument against free will. That's what I'm looking for. It's an extremely simple argument, argued for first way back in the 1960s by Jack Smart, who said that there were basically only two possibilities, and they exhaust all the possibilities because it's a logical disjunction or a dichotomy. In the first case, he said, if determinism is true of the world, if everything is dependent on a causal chain from the beginning of the universe, then the will is not free because everything in the universe will have been determined. Every event in space and time, which is the way Jack Smart thought about it, there will be just one possible new event, which was caused by all prior events up to that time. And we can call this the determinist or determinism objection to free will, that if the universe is determined, clearly we're not free. And notice this objection fits in with certain views, religious views, that a God has set up the entire world, knows exactly what's going to happen because that God is omniscient, omnipotent, and the world is going to do exactly what was in the plan to be done. And there are several kinds of determinism, but all of them basically make the will not free because nothing is really free. Now, the second aspect of this standard argument against free will is if there was any indeterminism in the world, if there was chance, then our will would not be in our control because it would have depended on those chance events, and thus we would not be responsible for those random actions. And this is a kind of responsibility issue we'll see has been historically connected with the idea of being free, because for many thinkers to be free is to be responsible for our actions. So we can call this the randomness objection. Now together these two could be combined in a responsibility objection, namely that no free will model has yet provided us an intelligible account of the agent control needed for moral responsibility. So let me spend a minute on this, this subject, because it's clear that if we identify the freedom of our will, the freedom to be not predetermined by prior events in our life, in the history of the universe, if we identify that with being responsible for our actions in a legal sense, in a moral sense, in general, saying that something happens in our brain that leads to an event, and the event sequence, if we think about it as a sequence of events, originated, the first cause would have been in our own minds. Aristotle called this with a phrase, things are up to us, they depend on us. And this is generally thought to be a view in which the world has agents, like human beings, and agents can cause things. So if we come back to Jack Smart's view of the universe, and he was very well known for thinking about relativity, the special relativity, and the idea that there's a space-time continuum, and he thought all events in that space-time continuum existed. Even at this time, everything in the future was essentially determined by looking at the universe as one big four-dimensional continuum. Every event causing the events, contributing to causing events that come later in time, and being determined by those past events which had causal influences on the current set of events. Okay, so what can we say about our standard argument if the universe is predetermined, or in our interesting case, if there are random events that occur, and that at least some of those occur in our minds? My favorite philosopher on this subject for the last couple decades has been William James. And William James argued that ideas might simply pop into our heads, and we would therefore be able to make a new idea which would lead to alternative possibilities if we had more than one idea on what to do next. Okay. I'm going to have to cancel this whole show because things are kind of happening out of control at the moment. But I want to, so let's go back and take a look at my book and point out that among all the problems that are identified, those in the philosophy area will come to physics later, and there'll be several interesting problems in physics that I hope to be able to talk to you about and help work out with your help. You see that our first Monday lecture was in the area of the mind and mind-body and so forth. But today we're into this side of the problem space on the problem of free will. Now, free will was the first subject I really addressed and wrote an enormous amount about back in the 2007, 8, 9 period, and I brought out a book specifically on the subject of free will. Let's take a quick look at that. I call free will a scandal in philosophy, and I do that for a reason. It seems to me that, looking on the back, I have some notes on this. The scandal, as I see it, is that academic philosophers are convincing a very large number of young students that they are biological machines whose actions are completely determined, arguing that everything that happens is a consequence of prior events is behind this. This is a concept known as naturalism. Naturalism argues that there are laws of nature, and that those laws of nature are what produce the next moment of time situation, depending on events that immediately preceded that moment. Now, I find this to be objectionable, especially when I believe human beings, and especially young ones starting out their careers in college, are creative persons. They can create new ideas, and those ideas are genuinely original, and they can take responsibility or praise from others for those ideas. The whole idea of praise and blame gets into difficult problems when we think that everything is determined. Indeed, there are some philosophers who are called hard determinists, who go so far as to say there is no such thing as moral responsibility. We're all of us just machines. When things happen, it's not that we're making them happen, it's that things are happening to us because of the rules of physics and biology and our genetic inheritance and our environmental conditioning. They have many rationalizations for why it is that we are the product of our past and not spontaneous original and creative in the moment, which I believe at least happens to us some of the time. I certainly agree we're mostly creatures of habit, and the things we do we repeat often because they've worked well for us in the past. And you can argue, well, how can it be free if I do the same thing today I did yesterday and earlier back at the time when I developed that habit? Some philosophers who are arguing for free will trace our freedom in doing something, again, we've done before because we thought it was a good thing to do. They trace it back to those earliest experiences and events in our lives where we actually did argue the case and defend one possibility. And when that possibility worked out well for us, it became one of those things we do all the time. That's Bob Kane, who is for some time my inspiration for arguing for libertarian free will. Let's just take a little moment to go over to our web pages here and once again enlarge them. And what I'd like to focus on this time is my list of philosophers and scientists, which is truly an enormous list, and see what the contents of some of these pages are. I mentioned Bob Kane. Let's just scroll down until we get into the G's and the H's and the K's. So here's Robert Kane right next to Immanuel Kant. And I argue that Kane, who's the editor of the Oxford Handbook of Free Will, is probably the dean of all the libertarian philosophers. And he had identified that at earlier times, before he started work in the 1960s, free will was considered to be dissolved by analytical language philosophers, not a real problem, just a pseudo-problem. But he developed his own ideas, and I invited Kane to visit me in Cambridge. This picture of him at the top I took in front of the Harvard Faculty Club when he spent some time here. And he came to my studio, I used to call it my lab, and sat where I'm sitting now. And from here, I made a video recording of Bob. And that video recording is available to us right here. Let's just jump into it and listen to his reminiscences of his initial work on free will in the 1960s.
In Augustine's classic work on the free choice of the will, where Evodius asks why God gave us free will since it brings so much.
I see once again I've got a little problem. I want him to be back at the beginning, and you'll see that at the beginning the information philosopher presents Robert Kane, professor of philosophy at the University of Texas in Austin, delivering a lecture on free will, new perspectives on an ancient problem.
My dealings with free will date back to the mid-1960s and are coterminous with a resurgence of interest among philosophers in problems about the freedom of the will that began in the decade of the 1960s. The landscape of the free will issue was very much simpler then. The unstated assumption was that if you had scientific leanings, you should be a compatibilist about free will, believing it to be compatible with determinism. That is, you should be a compatibilist if you did not deny we had free will altogether, as did skeptics and hard determinists. And if you were a libertarian about free will, believing in a free will that is incompatible with determinism, you must, in order to make sense of such a free will, inevitably appeal to uncaused causes, immaterial minds, noumenal selves, non-event causes, prime movers unmoved, and other examples of what P.F. Strawson called the panicky metaphysics of libertarianism in his influential.
So let's go over some of the points that Bob just introduced here. Terms like compatibilism, which is a very old idea, goes back to Thomas Hobbes, if not a little bit earlier, in which believers in the laws of nature and even the laws of God, that the future was already established and unavoidable, we could come to the conclusion that what free will consisted of was the freedom from constraints on our ability to act. Physical constraints, for example. If I'm not in chains, then I'm probably free, and that's usually known as freedom of action. But if I'm free in that sense, I don't need to be free in the sense that I might be able to do something that required indeterminism and random chance. This idea of being compatible, then, is that you accept the laws of physics, you accept naturalism, and you feel that there is only one possible future. As Dan Dennett likes to say, another future? Change the future? What will we change it from? What will we change it to? It's an interesting argument that's often known as actualism. Actualism goes back long before Dan Dennett to a philosopher before Aristotle's time named Diodorus Chronos. And Diodorus came up with an argument that the only thing that can possibly happen in the future is what actually will happen in the future. Now, it's a subtle argument, but it's an example of what philosophers do with their logical conclusions that they then apply to the world. He presumably thought through some ideas that Aristotle later discussed with the concept of whether there will be a sea battle next week. And he regarded that as it might or might not be that there will be a sea battle. But before him, Diodorus had argued that whether the sea battle occurs or does not occur next week, only one of them can be true, and the other must be false. Now, the way I look at that is that, well, either one of these may be true depending on what happens in the future. But to a logician, there isn't any third alternative between true and false in logic. To say there is a third possibility between true and false is to evade the law of the excluded middle, as it's called, that things in logic can only be true or false. Something, third possibility would be a three-value logic, whereas logic is thought to be bivalent. It has one or the other possibility, and that's all. So Diodorus had applied this argument, and it's seen in modern times in the work of Dan Dennett. We'll listen to a little of Dan in a moment. But today he is a prominent actualist, that the thing that will happen next week is the only thing that could happen. There is not any idea that in the past we could have done otherwise when we did the thing we chose to do, because the one thing that we actually did in retrospect must have been the only thing that we could possibly have done. I'm going to try to argue against that, and Bob Kane, I think, wants to argue against that. So let's take a look back away from this page, and we'll go over to this screen. And this time we'll use my big list of philosophers and scientists to find Dan Dennett somewhere here in the D's. And I'd love you to roam around these possible philosophers and read my own, see my own readings of these philosophers and what they've contributed to our modern debates. So here's Dan Dennett, and I'll open him up a bit. And I write, let's look a little closer at this, that Dan is a confirmed compatibilist. And I argue that he's even a determinist. Now let's sort of get a stronger look at these terms. As Kane said, there were compatibilists, and in the 1960s, most philosophers were compatibilists. They thought of themselves as compatibilists because how could they deny the laws of nature, the laws of physics? Like many who aren't scientists, they have a sort of physics envy, as some call it. They want their work to be just as solid and based in science as is physics, which is sort of the paradigmatic way of understanding the world and the nature of the world. But that was a view called determinism that went back centuries, and the 20th century, very importantly, came up with the idea of uncertainty, of indeterminism, and real chance in the world. Only a few thinkers before the 20th century thought that chance played a role in the world. One of them was William James, that we're going to be talking a lot about. His colleague in Cambridge and in American philosophy, Charles Sanders Peirce, also talked a great deal about chance. He had a theory of philosophy he called tychism. 2K is the Greek word for chance. And Peirce really wrote about it a lot, seemed to take it very seriously. But at the end of the day, he wanted that chance to be somehow under the control of some great agency. And I think in the end, he sort of bailed out on defending chance as a contributing factor in our lives. Although he was interested in evolution, he described it as a greedy process if chance was to be taking control of things like new species. Now, James was quite the opposite. He believed in the idea of evolution, and that the changing species and the creation of new species probably arose out of chance events in the history of evolution. That remains somewhat controversial even today. So just to get in our minds the possible positions we have in free will, one is to argue that the laws of physics are completely compatible with freedom and free will. I think many have argued that that's just nonsense, but even today, I would say, the majority of philosophers think that compatibilism is the preferred position. Now, Bob Kane wanted to argue for libertarian position, and in order to do that, as he said, he has to imagine, at least in the 1960s, he thought he had to imagine the possibilities of things like a spirit aspect, a dualistic aspect beyond the material world, which is subject to laws of physics. Many other people had touched on this idea. Immanuel Kant once divided the world into a phenomenal world of matter and physics that was controlled by laws like the Newtonian laws. And then there was a noumenal world. So he had a phenomenal world, which was all determined, and then a noumenal world, which was the locus of freedom, of God in Kant's work, and immortality. Now, my work will try to specify in a very clear way what those possibilities called freedom and God and immortality really amount to when you work in the modern terms I'm suggesting of looking at the information which is involved. Okay, so we've got a libertarian position, which has to, for some, but most, think must have involved some element of chance, some newness, some break in the causal chain. Think about the causal chain as producing everything that's happening to us today, and what we need is a break in that chain. What does that do for us? It says that the things that are happening are not predetermined by the events of the past. We're not under the control of laws of nature that determine, or I like to argue, predetermined, much like the religious notion of predestination, which is taught by Calvinists and others who think that what happens to us today was predestined by an omniscient God, typically. The position of a scientifically minded philosopher who thinks that things were predetermined is just a tiny step away from the religious position that our actions are all predestined. So the break in the causal chain can free us and make something new, make something created, new under the sun. But if it's random, it's then subject to the criticism that did you really, could you really take responsibility for this random event that happened in your brain? And my answer to that is, if the randomness involved a multiplicity of possibilities, some of which were old possibilities you'd had before many times, and then there came a time when a new idea occurred to you randomly. One particular model is that you remembered something, or you thought you saw something, and you were mistaken about that something, but on examination, that alternative possible thought turned out to be a pretty good thought, and you proceed to act upon it. And if it turns out well, you may act on it again in the future. And so you can think of yourself as having come up with an idea, and basically all the ideas that humanity has ever produced in the form of our knowledge had to have an origin in some human mind who first came up with that idea as a thought. And I argue that our thoughts are in fact free because they're stored in a brain as embodied in the brain. Ideas are embodied, information is embodied, but the information itself is an abstract quantity which can, when recalled, possibly have mistakes in it. And that's the source of what William James called the blooming, buzzing confusion in the mind, which can lead to many possibilities. He called them alternative possibilities. So we come back once again, we have a libertarian view that we have a freedom which means we are not predetermined, we're not predestined to do what we do, and we're in charge of things that happen when we think about them and possibly come up with new thoughts which turn into our actions. So that's contrasted with determinism. And William James, to spend another couple of moments with him, argued that there were two kinds of determinism. A hard determinism where, end of the story, we're just part of a movie, the movie's playing, the film is all done, and it's going to roll on, and whatever will happen, and there's nothing else. You know, this que sera, sera, what will be, we have nothing to do with it. There are many people in the world who are comfortable with that view of hard determinism on the grounds that we're in the hands of Allstate, or we're in the hands of God, who's, God willing, set up everything that's going to go on in the future, and we can relax and not feel too upset that we did something wrong that caused terrible things to happen. Determinism is a comfort in times of great problems, great tragedies, the tendency we all have to lean and say, well, that was out of our control, we really had nothing to do with it. Some people feel comfortable with that kind of thinking. So, okay, we have what Bob Kane's libertarianism, we have Dan Dennett's compatibilism, and we have hard determinism. Now, James called compatibilism soft determinism because he's absolutely right that compatibilism is still determinism. And it's called, he called it a wretched subterfuge. We're just trying to put things over on people and make them feel they're free when soft determinism or compatibilism really is not giving us any freedom of the will. So let's listen to Dan Dennett, who is, as I write here, a confirmed compatibilist. And he actually, in 1978, in his book called Brainstorms, gave a really nice description of what today I call a two-stage model of free will. We'll come back to that in a minute, but let's go down and find Dennett so you realize how to use, you see how to use my website. Here I am quoting Dan in a video he made for Big Think, and let's listen to him for a minute.
I think the hidden agenda, and not so hidden very often, for all of this is concern about free will. I think that at the bottom of the barrel, what people are really worried about is that if we have an entirely naturalistic and ultimately, in a certain sense, mechanistic at the nano level.
Whoops.
at the protein level. If we have a mechanistic theory of consciousness, this will show that, oh my gosh, we don't have free will, and then life has no meaning, and I can't be responsible for my best or worst deeds. And that doesn't follow. But fear that it would follow rattles people and deflects them from taking these ideas seriously because they really don't want them to be true. My approach to that is to challenge that desire and say, no, everything you want or should want in the way of free will, you can have on this picture. There's some traditional notions of free will that turn out to be impossible on this view. Tough. But why do you want them? They're not important. They are simply ill-founded desires. The varieties of free will worth wanting, you can have. And so take a deep breath, relax, and let's figure out how it's done. For billions of years on this.
So Dan is giving us an argument, and I'm not sure why I'm always getting this, whoops. It's an example, once again, of my inabilities to control these things. Here we are back to Dan's page, and I need to figure out why it is I can't put this full screen and why this little set of advertising is coming up on the front, links to other websites like Noam Chomsky. Normally when I go here,
there was life but no free will. As the old tag would have it, it's noblesse oblige. We have the power, and that's what gives us the obligation. And that's what makes us free in a way that no bird is free, for instance.
So back to one more candidate person that I'd like to have you hear from, and that is, let me get back to an information philosopher page. Go there. Once again, scroll down. This time to one of my colleagues at Harvard, who has written a wonderful book on how the mind works, and one of the most entertaining thinkers in our Department of Philosophy. And I find that Pinker was one of the clearest, simplest views of the standard argument against free will. I'm not sure he gives that in this lecture of his, this brief lecture on Big Think, but let's listen to him for just a moment. Now there's the widen to the whole page, which is very nice. And let me take that to the big screen.
I don't believe there's such a thing as free will in the sense of a ghost in the machine, a spirit or soul that somehow reads the TV screen of the senses and pushes buttons and pulls levers of behavior. There's no sense that we can make of that. I think our behavior is the product of physical processes in the brain. On the other hand, when you have a brain that consists of 100 billion neurons connected by 100 trillion synapses, there is a vast amount of complexity that means that human consequences. All of those things carve out the realm of behavior that we call free will, which it is useful to distinguish from brute involuntary reflexes, but which doesn't necessarily have to involve some mysterious soul.
Okay. What we hear from Steve Pinker is that the mind and the brain are probably just the same thing, that there is nothing different from the neurons, which could be called a spirit or a soul, or what he called the ghost in the machine. The ghost in the machine was a metaphor, a very popular one, Let me just take a moment to go here, and I basically think I could then change to another input like this, and then I'll come back to us with this cut and be a little closer on screen with you. Here we go. In the 1950s, a famous British philosopher named Gilbert Ryle wrote a book on the concept of mind, in which he basically made the argument that there is no mind. There's only a brain. I've surveyed 4 of the top psychology textbooks that are very popular in the 8th, 9th, 10th editions and widely used in colleges everywhere on psychology. And in each case, I looked in the index under mind to see what they had to say. One of them had no entry in the index for the word mind. Another one had mind, comma, see brain. No question that in those, the views of those psychologists, there is only a brain, and that corresponds to Steve Pinker's presentation we just heard. Now, others were a little bit better, and the one I liked the best basically had an entry for mind and referred you to the concept of the word psychology, which is a combination of the psyche, the Greek word for a soul or a spirit, and logos, which basically was the word we use for various scientists like biology and so forth. So that book at least reminded us that psychology is the study of the mind. But today, and even as early as the 1920s, psychologists who invented the new field of behaviorism were distinctly opposed to the idea of a mind because they argued in very simple sort of positivistic thinking that if something can't be observed, it shouldn't be a subject of scientific study. So the behaviorists absolutely put down all the great work that had happened in the end of the 19th century with William James' Principles of Psychology, for example, where he described many things that he thought were going on in minds, many of which are today serious subjects of study in modern neuroscience and modern psychology. But going back to the 1920s with John Watson, and then in the 1930s, B.F. Skinner at Harvard, they basically said, we can't talk about the mind. It's metaphysical, they said, which in those days was an insult. The great Vienna Circle, the school of logical empiricists, Ludwig Wittgenstein was a member, and it grew out of logical positivism, which is the work of Bertrand Russell and Wittgenstein. The early Wittgenstein was a logical positivist, and later he changed to becoming I had an idea that philosophy was done by careful conceptual analysis of language, and he started the school known as analytic language philosophy, which ruled many years in the 20th century. And both the positivists and the empiricists and the analytic language philosophers all had assumed and accepted this notion that the mind was metaphysical. And they would famously say, they ruled out the study of metaphysics, which is a very deep kind of underlying notion that we're getting to the underlying foundations of the reality, learning to understand reality and describing it, so that in the view of the metaphysicist, all of physics better make sense logically, if that can be used, and that's very questionable, about the foundations of physics, foundations of reality, understanding nature. Metaphysics had a bad name, and along with that, mind had a bad name, and Gilbert Ryle said, look, the mind is just a ghost in a machine, because humans are machines. Today we think not only humans are machines, but our minds or our brain is a computer. And my work in information philosophy is to try to argue that We are not machines, and our brains are not computers. Anyone thinks that really doesn't know very much about computers. Although Dan Dennett is very fond of computers and computer analogies, and Steve Pinker thinks that the computational model of the mind, of the brain as a computer, is the best theory today. But coming back to what Bob Kane said, in the 1960s, following right after Gilbert Ryle's work, in order to talk about a freedom of the will, it seemed to require a suspension of the laws of nature as they saw them, as a determinist saw them. And it would be something like an uncaused cause, Bob said, or an immaterial soul. And those were the words that were used to attack concepts that there was more than our material bodies. And now, to me, it's now 60, 70 years later, I am strongly hoping that I can bring back the notion that information, abstract information, the kind of information that's in a computer program, thought to be the software in the hardware, that kind of information is not itself matter or energy. It is not material, although it needs matter to be embodied. So when we have ideas in our brain, it's the mind holding information, abstract information about our ideas, which are used to generate our thoughts. The brain then can be considered to be a kind of a natural machine-like thing, which is being used to generate new ideas and thoughts and so forth. Okay, a side note about Dan Dennett that we've just listened to, his study, graduate study, was under Gilbert Ryle back in the 1950s. And so we can see Dennett for decades holding on to a very solid view, which was the view in the middle of the 20th century. At the same time, Dennett did a very nice job of suggesting what he called his Valerian model for the mind, or for freedom of the will, which he proposed to libertarian philosophers should be considered as a model. Let's just break out of this page and see if we can get back to Dan Dennett. Here he is, and close this one. I'll need to go here for just a moment so we can see where we're working. And I'm having a problem getting back to Dennett. I'll just do this page and say go. And here we are in his page. Scroll down to the bottom. So following the poet Paul Valéry, Dennett suggested a way to combine indeterminism to generate alternative possibilities. Now, several others, starting with William James, had argued for alternative possibilities. And then there would be a second stage. And in the second stage, we would have the adequately determined choice process, the decision process, okay? Let's just read a little bit from Brainstorms. The model of decision-making I am proposing has the following feature. When we are faced with an important decision, a consideration generator whose output is to some degree undetermined produces a series of considerations, some of which may of course be immediately rejected as irrelevant by the agent, whether consciously or unconsciously. By a matter of habit and understanding, a new idea might be just not even considered for more than a fraction of a second, if at all. Those considerations that are selected by the agent as having a more than negligible bearing on the decision then figure in a reasoning process. And if the agent is in the main reasonable, those considerations ultimately serve as predictors and explicators of the agent's final decision. Well, when I read that work in 1978, I was convinced that now philosophers would come to understand the way free will works. It was 1978. I was busy inventing things, and my thoughts on free will and other thoughts on cosmology had to be set aside while my wife and I, both astrophysicists, unable to get jobs at the same institution, went out to find ourselves another way of staying right here in Cambridge. But when we went to a talk by Dan Dennett in Harvard Square, and he gave these arguments. And I was very impressed with these arguments. Let's come back to them again. First, he says, there are 6 reasons. First, the intelligent selection, rejection, and weighing of the considerations that do occur to the subject is a matter of intelligence making the difference. That's the idea that in a second stage, we are seriously thinking, we're looking to our moral views, our values, our character, our intelligence, and so forth. Second, he says, I think it installs indeterminism in the right place for the libertarian, if there is a right place at all. Now, this is very important because Dennett doesn't believe there is a right place. He doesn't think quantum indeterminism, the fundamental ontological chance that quantum physics now tells us exists, should not play a role in explanations of free will. Third, he says, from the point of view of biological engineering, it's just more efficient and in the end more rational that decision-making should occur in this way. That's good. The fourth observation is that it permits moral education to make a difference without making all the difference. In other words, you might be educated and propagandized or have your mind organized or your values arranged by some big belief system which may take away your ultimate freedom. Anyway, fifth, and I think this is perhaps the most important thing to be said, it provides some account of our important intuition that we are the authors of our moral decisions. And finally, the model points to the multiplicity of decisions that encircle our moral decisions. So let me just go back to Dan here and say something that is the most fundamental criticism of all those thinkers, including Bob Kane, who try to argue for free will. If you read them carefully, and I've been working awfully hard reading hundreds of books and position papers and articles over the last several decades, you'll find that most philosophers, especially those who are compatibilists, argue that it's more important that what the free will model gives us is moral responsibility, moral competence, which is Dan Dennett's favorite phrase. And they therefore combine the idea of free will with moral responsibility. And historically, through the centuries, a free will is thought to be free when it makes moral decisions. To my mind, the question of moral responsibility, what are the rules, what is good behavior, good actions, and what are bad or evil actions. And I want to argue that moral questions are questions for a specific culture. Different societies, different groups of people following different religious beliefs, etc., have in general often quite different ideas about what is a moral action. I believe that moral responsibility is a cultural problem, a societal problem, psychological problem also perhaps. It is not a physical problem. The problem of free will, on the other hand, really comes down to our physical, even metaphysical understanding of how the world works. If the world includes breaks in the chain of predeterminism or predestination, then we are free in the sense that we are not the product of the past. And there is not just one possible thing that can happen at any moment for us. Instead, we can create new things and have new thoughts, and those thoughts can lead to different actions among which we choose when we do choose. The fact that it leads to a moral responsibility is a really separate question. And let me talk to you about that for a moment. Let me go into my freedom section. And here I want to, let's go back again. Okay, and then it. I don't know where I am here.
Dave,
Typical
I've always
problem.
been fascinated by the concept of existence. And when I think about existence, what that means, I'm always back to consciousness.
We're going to have to wind up this
But
show
then I see
without
some
talking to you
philosophers telling me
about
that consciousness is an
freedom
illusion. Doesn't really.
and moral responsibility. Here we are again, and I'm going to touch free will here, bring it down, and talk about moral responsibility. But I see I'm running out of time, and we'll have to come back to the question of separating the freedom part of free will from the moral responsibility part. And we'll actually go on to separate moral responsibility from the question of punishment. There's a great deal of argumentation that many times we're not actually responsible for the things that we do because we're under constraints like incapacity for some reason, drug addiction, others are often considered, so that we should moderate our ideas about how responsible a person is both legally and morally. We'll have to take these things up again on another Tuesday lecture. Apologies for the errors made today as I'm learning how to do my online lectures. Thank you.